The copper taste of my own blood filled my mouth as Arthur leaned down, his tailored Tom Ford suit spotless, whispering that my family's shipping empire was finally his. Beside him, my stepsister Chloe smiled, holding the syringe that stopped my heart. I died in the dark, but I woke up with a pen in my hand. The smell of burning sugar and expensive French lavender always made me sick after that night. But on October 14th, 2024, I was sitting at the mahogany dining table in our penthouse overlooking Central Park, staring at a silver tray of crème brûlée. Arthur sat across from me. He was cutting into a medium-rare filet mignon, his movements precise, his hands steady. Those were the same hands that, in what felt like less than an hour ago, had pinned my shoulders to the cold linoleum floor of an abandoned warehouse in New Jersey, while the rain beat against the corrugated iron roof. "You're quiet tonight, Vivian," he said. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He possessed the absolute, unwavering arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. He was 32, the CEO of Vance & Cross Logistics, a company that 60% belonged to my family's estate, though his name was the one on the frosted glass doors. "The quarterly reports for the Atlantic routes need your signature before midnight. Don't forget." My fingers tightened around the heavy silver fork. My jaw ached from how hard I was clenching my teeth, a fierce, hot pulse throbbing behind my ears. I looked down at my wrists. They were bare, smooth, white. No purple bruises from zip ties, no puncture marks from the potassium chloride injection Chloe had pressed into my vein, while she laughed about how easily I had handed over my grandfather's legacy. I was back. It was exactly 2 years before my death. "Vivian," Arthur's voice carried a sharp, impatient edge. He set his knife down with a soft click against the porcelain. "Did you hear me?" "I heard you," I said. My voice sounded flat, hollow to my own ears, but to him it just sounded like compliance. I had spent 7 years being the dutiful, quiet wife, the brilliant strategist who stayed in the Home Office, drafting the algorithms and securing the maritime contracts while he played the visionary billionaire on CNBC. In my past life, I thought our marriage was a partnership. I thought his coldness was just stress. I didn't know he had been systematically transferring assets from my family's trust into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands called A&C Holdings. I didn't know the A stood for Arthur and the C stood for Chloe, my stepsister. The girl my father had adopted when he married her manipulative mother. The girl I had shared my clothes, my home, and my inheritance with. "The Atlantic reports," I repeated, forcing my hands to loosen, letting my fork rest naturally. "I'll look them over in the study." "Good. I have a late meeting at the Harvard Club with some investors. Don't wait up." He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, stood, and checked his Rolex Daytona. He didn't kiss me. He never did unless there was a photographer nearby. The moment the heavy oak front door clicked shut, the silence of the penthouse rushed in. I didn't cry. The tears had been burned out of me in that warehouse while I watched the snow mix with my own blood on the floor. Instead, I walked down the hallway to my private study, locked the door, and opened my laptop. My hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the sheer volume of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I opened the encrypted drive where I kept the source codes for our proprietary logistics tracking software, the software I designed, which allowed our fleet to bypass port congestion and cut fuel costs by 40%. It was the sole reason our valuation had hit $4 billion last month. I looked at the date on the screen. October 14th, 2024. In my previous life, on October the 15th, I signed the Omnibus Transfer Act that gave Arthur total power of attorney over my remaining shares while I underwent a routine surgery for an ovarian cyst. A surgery that, I later realized, had been recommended by a doctor Chloe had introduced to me. During that recovery, they gutted me. They took the company, they took my father's house in Greenwich, and eventually, when I discovered the fraud, they took my life. I pulled out a crisp sheet of heavy cardstock from the bottom drawer. It wasn't the omnibus transfer. It was a standard, no-fault divorce petition, drafted by a firm I had retained in secret 3 years ago when I first felt the cold distance in my marriage, but had never had the courage to file. I signed it. My signature was sharp, clean, devoid of the hesitation that used to define me. Next, I opened my personal banking portal. I had an account under my maiden name, Cross, which Arthur had never bothered to look at, because he assumed it only contained my grandfather's small personal stipend. He didn't know I had been day trading maritime futures since I was 22. There was $42 million sitting in that account. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart, a number I hadn't called in the old timeline because I had been too proud, too blind. "Raymond," I said, when the line picked up on the second ring. Raymond Vance was Arthur's uncle, the ousted founder of the company, the man Arthur had publicly humiliated and forced out of the board 5 years ago. "Vivian?" Raymond's voice was gruff, smelling of the cigars he smoked constantly in his townhouse in Boston. "Why are you calling me at 10 on a Tuesday? If Arthur finds out—" "Arthur is at the Harvard Club with my stepsister Chloe," I interrupted, my voice as steady as granite. "And by this time next month, he isn't going to have a company left to bar you from. I need your proxy votes for the November shareholder meeting. All of them." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing in his background. "What are you doing, girl?" "I'm taking back what belongs to my father," I said, "and I'm giving you the chance to watch Arthur beg on his knees. Do we have a deal?" "I'll fly to New York tomorrow morning," Raymond replied softly. I hung up. I walked to the master bedroom, opened the safe, and took out my passport, my birth certificate, and the original deeds to the Greenwich estate which my father had wisely left solely in my name, bypassing the marital estate entirely. I packed one small Rimowa suitcase with essential clothes, my laptop, and the legal documents. I left the signed divorce papers exactly where he always left his dirty coffee cups, on the marble island in the kitchen, weighted down by my 4-carat diamond engagement ring. The ring was a conflict diamond. How fitting. By midnight, I was in an Uber Black, watching the lights of Manhattan blur through the rain. I didn't look back. Arthur didn't love me. He loved the architecture of my life and the wealth that supported his ambition. He wouldn't panic tonight. He would think I was throwing a tantrum. He would think I'd be back by Friday because I always came back. He had no idea that the woman who used to forgive him had died in a warehouse 2 years from now, and the woman sitting in this car was a ghost who had already written his obituary. The air in the offices of Cross Maritime Logistics on the 45th floor of the Chrysler Building always felt thin. But on Monday morning, 3 weeks after I vanished, it felt completely stagnant. I hadn't answered a single one of Arthur's text messages. He had sent 5 the first week, all variations of, "Where are you?" "This is childish. We have the Vanguard group dinner on Thursday." By the second week, they stopped. He assumed I was staying at a luxury resort in Miami on his dime, waiting for an apology he never intended to give. He didn't realize I had frozen the joint Amex Centurion cards the very night I left, cards that were backed by my family's trust accounts, not his corporate salary. I stood in the glass-walled conference room of Apex Global Partners, a rival shipping firm I had quietly purchased a controlling interest in using my private futures fund over the last 20 days. "The migration is complete, Miss Cross," said Thomas, my lead software engineer, his eyes bloodshot from working 72 hours straight. He pointed to the monitors lining the wall. "The proprietary routing algorithm, the one Vance and Cross relies on for their entire East Coast delivery network, has been completely decoupled from their servers. We revoked the enterprise license an hour ago, citing breach of contract under Section 9 of the 2022 Development Agreement." Section 9. A tiny clause my father had insisted on inserting into the original software lease when Arthur first became CEO. It stated that if the majority shareholder of Cross family stock, me, was no longer actively serving on the board or residing in the primary marital residence, the software license could be terminated with 30 days' notice. Arthur had never read the fine print. He had been too busy signing magazine covers as the disruptor of logistics. "What's the immediate impact?" I asked, my hands folded neatly over my cream-colored Max Mara coat. "Total blind spots," Thomas said, a grim smile touching his lips. As of 9 a.m., 84 container ships carrying over $2 billion in perishable cargo and retail goods for the holiday season are sitting outside the ports of Newark, Savannah, and Miami. Their systems can't interface with the automated port cranes anymore. They're stuck in the queue. Every hour they sit there costs them $400,000 in demurrage fees. Right on cue, my phone began to buzz in my hand. Arthur's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. On the 5th attempt, I answered. I didn't say hello. "Vivian, where the hell are you?" Arthur's voice lacked its usual smooth, patrician cadence. He was panting slightly, the background noise full of shouting traders and ringing landlines. "The system is down. The whole grid is dark. Thomas and the entire IT development team didn't show up for work this morning, and the servers are locked. Did you do this? Is this some pathetic revenge because I didn't come home 3 weeks ago?" "I sent you the divorce papers, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping an octave, completely devoid of inflection. "They've been on your kitchen counter for 21 days. Did you think they were a dinner invitation? Don't play games with me, Vivian." He slammed his fist onto a desk, the sound crackling through the receiver. "We have a contract with Walmart and Target for the Black Friday rush. If those ships don't unload by Friday, the penalties will bankrupt our logistics division. Call Thomas. Fix the server link. We can talk about the divorce later. I'll give you whatever settlement you want, but do not touch the company." "The company doesn't belong to you, Arthur. It belongs to the shareholders," I said smoothly. "And as of 9 o'clock this morning, the board has received a formal request for an emergency meeting this Thursday. I suggest you look at your email. You're going to need a very good lawyer." I hung up before he could reply. Next, I turned my attention to Chloe. My stepsister hadn't called me once since I left. She thought she was being clever, staying in the background, playing the comforting confidant to Arthur while he complained about his crazy wife. She was currently working as the chief curator for the Cross Cultural Foundation, a charity my mother had established, which held over $40 million worth of impressionist art. In my past life, Chloe had used the foundation's funds to launder the money Arthur was stealing from the shipping business, hiding the cash transfers under the guise of art acquisitions from shell galleries in Switzerland. I had discovered the receipts only days before they killed me. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the New York District Attorney's white-collar crime division. I had a courier already waiting outside their building with a flash drive containing 5 years of tax returns, bank routing numbers, and forged gallery invoices bearing Chloe's distinctive loopy signature. "Hello, Detective Vance," I said when the call connected. "My name is Vivian Cross. I believe you've been looking into the offshore art auctions hosted by the Cross Foundation. I have the complete ledger." By Wednesday afternoon, the cracks in Arthur's empire were visible from space. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story. Logistics giant Vance and Cross facing unprecedented system outage. Holiday supply chains at risk. Their stock price, which had opened at $114 per share on Monday, had tumbled to $68 by Wednesday closing bell. Arthur was frantic. He had left 26 voicemails. He had gone to my father's house in Greenwich, only to be turned away at the iron gates by private security guards I had hired from a firm run by ex-Mossad operatives. He had tried to access our joint accounts, only to find them completely liquidated and the funds moved into a trust that he couldn't touch without a Supreme Court order. He was beginning to realize that I hadn't just walked away. I had taken the floor with me. The board meeting on Thursday morning was held in the executive suite of the St. Regis Hotel, a neutral ground insisted upon by the nervous institutional investors who held 30% of the company's stock. Arthur arrived first. When I walked into the room, followed by Raymond and 3 senior partners from Skadden, ARPS, Arthur looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. His usually immaculate hair was damp from the autumn drizzle, and his tie was slightly askew. The arrogance was still there, but it was brittle now, like old ice. "Vivian." He stood up, his palms flat on the glass conference table. I noticed they were sweating, leaving small, foggy prints on the clean surface. "Thank God." "Raymond, I don't know what lies she told you to get you here, but we need to put a united front forward for the press. The stock is down 40%. If we don't announce that the software issue is resolved today, the banks are going to call our margin loans." I sat down at the head of the table, not the side. The head. Raymond sat to my right, unpacking a thick stack of blue-bound legal documents. "The software issue isn't an issue, Arthur," I said, leaning back, crossing my legs. "The software belongs to Apex Global, and Apex has no intention of licensing its intellectual property to a company managed by an incompetent CEO. "Incompetent?" Arthur laughed, a short, sharp bark that sounded dangerously close to hysteria. "I built this empire. I put our name on every container ship from Rotterdam to Shanghai. You were just sitting in the house, Vivian, playing with spreadsheets." "Those spreadsheets were the only thing keeping your ships from colliding in the mid-Atlantic, Arthur," I said, my voice cutting through his anger like a scalpel. "You didn't build this company. You inherited my father's reputation, and then you used it to borrow money you can't pay back." One of the institutional investors, a representative from Vanguard named Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat. "Arthur, we received a document from Ms. Cross's legal counsel this morning. It appears that over the past 24 months, 19 separate wire transfers totaling $85 million were sent from our corporate operations account to an entity called A&C Holdings in Grand Cayman. Can you explain these expenses?" Arthur's face drained of color so fast I thought he might faint. His mouth opened, closed, and then opened again. He looked at the document Henderson pushed across the table. It was a copy of the bank transfers, complete with his digital signature. This is a specialized consulting fee," Arthur stammered, his fingers twitching against his trousers. "For market research. It's completely legitimate. A consulting fee paid to a shell corporation owned by your wife's stepsister, Chloe?" Raymond spoke up, his voice dripping with old, cold satisfaction. He leaned forward, blowing a slow breath through his nose. "A corporation whose primary spending account just paid for a $3 million villa in St. Bart's under your name, Arthur." The silence in the room became absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the hotel's ventilation system. Arthur, I said softly, drawing his eyes back to mine. He looked terrified, the exact same look I had given him when Chloe pulled out that syringe in the warehouse. The poetic symmetry of it was beautiful. The board is going to vote now. Raymond and I control 58% of the voting shares. We are removing you as CEO, effective immediately for cause, which means your golden parachute is void. You can't do this, he whispered, his voice trembling. Vivian, please. We're married. Everything I did for our future. Our future ended in a warehouse in New Jersey, Arthur, I said. It was a slip of the tongue, a reference to a timeline he didn't know existed, but it didn't matter. To him, it just sounded like I knew everything about his plans to discard me. Before he could speak, the double doors of the conference room opened. Two plainclothes officers from the NYPD, accompanied by Detective Vance from the DA's office, stepped into the room. Arthur spun around, his face slick with sweat now. What is this? Arthur Vance? Detective Vance asked, pulling a pair of stainless steel handcuffs from his belt. You're under arrest for grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Please step away from the table. As the metal cuffs clicked around Arthur's wrists, the sharp, brutal sound echoing off the wood paneling, I felt the first real breath of air enter my lungs in weeks. He looked back at me over his shoulder as they led him out, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic pleading. I didn't look away. I watched him until the door closed. But the day wasn't over. I left the St. Regis and drove straight to the Cross Cultural Foundation's gallery on Upper East Side. Chloe was there, hosting a private viewing for a group of wealthy patrons from the Upper East Side. She was wearing an emerald green silk dress, sipping champagne, laughing with her head tilted back. The exact same laugh she used when she told me my father's heart attack hadn't been an accident. That was the first major twist I had uncovered during my deep dive into the financial records over the last 2 weeks. My father hadn't died of natural causes in 2023. Chloe had been managing his medication. She had changed his digitalis dosage, slowly weakening him until his heart gave out, leaving her mother and her the initial shares that Arthur then used to take control. I walked into the gallery. The patrons fell quiet as they noticed the tension radiating from my posture. Chloe saw me, her smile freezing on her face. Vivian, she said, setting her glass down on a silver tray. Where have you been? Arthur has been worried sick. The police are at the penthouse, Chloe, I said, loud enough for every person in the room to hear. They've just finished searching your private office at the foundation. Her hand flew to her throat, her manicured nails digging into her skin. What are you talking about? Why would the police? They found the dual ledgers, I said, taking a step toward her. She backed up against a marble pedestal holding a Rodin sculpture. They found the records of the fake art purchases you used to clean the $85 million Arthur stole from my family. And they found something else. They found the medical logs from my father's private nurse. The ones you altered. Chloe's eyes went wild. She looked around the room for support, but her wealthy friends were already backing away, their faces masks of horror and disgust. You're crazy. You're lying. Arthur already confessed, I lied, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that only she could hear. He gave you up 5 minutes after the handcuffs went on, Chloe. He said the whole thing was your idea, especially my father's medication. Her face went entirely grey. She didn't just sweat. She began to shake violently, her knees buckling slightly. No, he wouldn't. He promised me we'd leave together. He promised me. He lied, I said. Just like you did. 2 more police officers entered the gallery doors behind me. The sound of their heavy boots on the polished hardwood floors was the final note in the symphony. As they took Chloe by the arms, she screamed, a raw, ugly, screeching sound that shattered the refined atmosphere of the gallery. She struggled, her green silk dress ripping at the shoulder, her expensive hair falling into her face as she was dragged past the priceless paintings she had stolen to afford. I stood in the center of the gallery, completely still, watching her go. The air smelled of expensive perfume, old canvas, and retribution. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled over the ruins of the Vance and Cross empire. The company had been completely restructured. I had taken it private, rebranding it as Cross Maritime Logistics, restoring my father's original logo to every ship, crane, and container. Raymond was running the operations out of Boston, happier than he had been in a decade, while I retained 80% ownership from my new office in London. I had sold the Manhattan penthouse and every piece of furniture inside it. I didn't want anything that had ever been touched by their shadows. Arthur's trial had been short. Confronted with the digital paper trail and Chloe's immediate, terrified decision to turn state's evidence against him in hopes of a lighter sentence for the murder of my father, his defense had collapsed within days. He was sentenced to 25 years at Sing Sing for corporate fraud and conspiracy. Chloe received 20 years for her role in my father's death. But there was one final secret. The second twist that I had kept hidden until the day of Arthur's final asset forfeiture hearing. I sat in the back of the federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan, wearing a tailored black suit. Arthur was brought in, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands chained to a leather belt around his waist. He had lost 40 pounds. The sharp jawline he used to pride himself on was covered in a graying, unkempt beard. He looked broken, a ghost of the man who had stood over me in that New Jersey warehouse. His lawyer stood up to address the judge. "Your Honor, my client has agreed to liquidate all remaining personal assets, including his private investment portfolio, to satisfy the restitution order for the defrauded shareholders. However, we request that the court preserve the title to the property at 414 Ferry Street in Newark. It is an abandoned commercial site with no market value, but it is the only asset my client inherited from his grandfather. The 414 Ferry Street, the warehouse where they killed me." I stood up from the gallery and walked to the microphone at the petitioner's table. Arthur's head snapped around when he heard my heels click against the floor. His eyes widened, a mixture of fear and twisted hope flaring in them. "Your Honor," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the high-ceilinged room. "I have a prior lien on that property. I purchased the outstanding mortgage on 414 Ferry Street from Deutsche Bank 3 months ago through a subsidiary. The property is already mine." Arthur gripped the edge of the defense table, his chains rattling loudly. "Vivian, why? Why do you want that garbage lot? You've taken everything else. You've ruined my life. Why take that?" I looked him dead in the eye. He didn't know about the alternate timeline. He didn't know about the rain, the zip ties, or the syringe. But he knew the weight of my hatred now. "Because I'm going to tear it down, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, steady whisper that carried across the courtroom. "I'm going to bulldoze every single brick of that warehouse into the dirt, and I'm going to build a public park for the children of the workers you underpaid for 7 years. I'm erasing every trace that you ever existed." Arthur's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He collapsed back into his chair, his head dropping into his chained hands as he began to sob, loud, dry, desperate chest heaves that filled the courtroom with the sound of his total defeat. He finally understood that there was no mercy coming. There was no version of reality where he won. I turned my back on him while he was still crying, walking out of the courtroom into the bright April sunshine of Manhattan. The air was crisp, clean, and completely free of lavender. I had survived the dark. I had rewritten the future. And for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I was finally free. Part 4. I felt the warmth of the sun on my face as I stood on the granite steps of the courthouse, but the satisfaction wasn't complete yet. There was still one final ledger to balance. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, dialing the direct line to the State Penitentiary's administrative office. Thanks to my substantial donations to the Prison Reform Board over the last quarter, the warden answered on the first ring. "Is the transfer complete?" I asked, watching a yellow cab pull up to the curb. "Yes, Ms. Cross," the warden replied. "Chloe was moved to the maximum security wing at Bedford Hills this morning, and per your request regarding her work assignment, she has been assigned to the laundry facility, 12-hour shifts, starting at 5 a.m. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, smelling the phantom scent of chemical bleach and hot, suffocating steam. In the original timeline, during my final days when they kept me locked in the basement of the Greenwich house before taking me to the warehouse, Chloe had forced me to wash her stained clothes by hand in the utility sink, mocking me while I scrubbed. Now, she would spend the next 2 decades breathing in industrial detergent, her hands blistering under the heat of machines she couldn't control. Mirror Justice was a patient architect. "Thank you, Warden," I said, hanging up. I climbed into the back of the waiting town car. My destination wasn't the airport, nor was it the corporate headquarters of Cross Maritime. It was a small, unassuming brownstone on Perry Street in Greenwich Village. This was the second twist, the piece of the puzzle that neither Arthur nor the federal prosecutors had ever uncovered. I unlocked the heavy iron gate, walked down the short flight of stone steps, and knocked 3 times on the thick mahogany door. A woman opened it. She was in her late 50s, wearing a simple wool cardigan, her face etched with deep lines of exhaustion. It was Eleanor Vance, Arthur's biological mother, the woman he had told the world had died in a psychiatric hospital 20 years ago to protect his blue blood image at the yacht club. "Vivian," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped aside to let me in. The interior of the house smelled of old books and Earl Grey tea. "Is it over? The judge signed the final asset forfeiture an hour ago, Eleanor," I said, setting my purse on the entryway table. "The trust fund we set up under your maiden name is fully funded. $3 million, completely insulated from Arthur's bankruptcy proceedings." Eleanor sank into a plush armchair, her hands clasping together so tightly her knuckles turned white. Tears leaked from her eyes, but they were tears of profound relief. He thought he was so clever. He thought because he locked me away and stole my inheritance to fund his first shipping lease, I would just disappear. He never imagined his own wife would find me. That was the secret weapon I had spent the first 3 months of my reborn life tracking down. Arthur hadn't built his initial capital from a brilliant tech investment, as his PR firm claimed. He had forged his mother's signature on a power of attorney document, while she was heavily medicated in a private sanitarium in upstate New York, using her ancestral land as collateral. I had found her, freed her legal status, and used her testimony as the hidden leverage that guaranteed the feds would look into Arthur's Cayman accounts with absolute scrutiny. "He will never bother you again," I said, sitting across from her, my hands resting calmly on my knees. "He thinks you're dead. Let him keep believing that while he sits in a 12 by 12 cell. The money is yours. The house is yours." "And what about you, my dear?" Eleanor asked, wiping her cheeks with a linen handkerchief. You've spent 2 years living like a ghost, calculating every step. When do you start living for yourself? I looked out the low window, watching the rain start to drizzle against the glass, matching the rhythm of the New York afternoon. If you felt the cold weight of justice in your chest today, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to believe that second chances are real and that the people who hurt you will eventually face the storm they created. Subscribe to the channel to follow my next rebirth journey, where the stakes are even higher and the vengeance is even sweeter. Thank you for listening, and stay powerful.